My mother was a victim of domestic violence, and I remember watching her beating to the point of unconsciousness on many times. The next morning, I drove myself to the hospital, quietly had my test, and drove home. On Wednesday, the doctor called with the results. 4 spots had showed up on the test. 3 tested positive for malignancy. 1 was not. That's why we're told to come as little children. God doesn't ask us to logically think about healing, but to rely on Him in faith. How big is your God? Is He strong enough to heal your marriage or heal your child? Is He bigger than a positive MRI or a negative work evaluation? Tonight I'm going to tell you my story, and I want to start out by telling you I recently read a book, and the book was entitled The Circle Maker. And the book asks on the back, how big is your God? Is He strong enough to heal your marriage or heal your child? Is He bigger than a positive MRI or a negative work evaluation? Is He bigger than your secret sin or your secret dream? Is He bigger than your addictions or your struggles? How big is your God? Today I'm going to answer the question for you on how big is my God. Sometimes the hardest part of writing your story is knowing where to begin. For lack of a better place, I'll just start at the beginning. I honestly believe that my struggles began at conception. You see, I'm an adopted child, and it's common for most adopted children to have a struggle with rejection. I've learned a few facts of my birth over the years. My biological mother was married, but not to the man who was my biological father. Immediately after I was born, she told the nurse to find me a good home and immediately walked out of my life. I don't have illusions of a sweet young girl struggling with giving her child a better life. My mother was in her mid-30s, and I was the 4th child she'd given up for adoption. I think in the womb I could feel her rejection, and I think that's why it's so deep-rooted. A nurse at the hospital contacted my adopted mother and asked if she was interested in a child. My mother immediately said yes, and my father immediately said no. My mother gave him 2 choices. They either adopted me or she would leave him. 6 weeks later, I was placed on a plane and flown to Johnson City from a small rural town in the Midwest. My adopted mother was very kind and loving. My adopted father struggles with substance abuse, and you never really know what day you're going to catch him on. He was a truck driver, and when I grew up, he was gone a lot. When he was home, our household changed, and everybody was on edge. You would, and still does for that matter, fly into a rage for no reason at all. My mother was a victim of domestic violence, and I remember watching her beating to the point of unconsciousness on many times. My uncle lived in the house next door, and he also suffered from alcoholism. He would often come to our house in the middle of the night because he wanted fried chicken. And my mother was so codependent that she would get me up, and we would get in the car, and we would go to a place called Henny Penny at 3 a.m. in the morning to get him food. I was in college before I realized that not every family ate fried chicken in the middle of the night. But I was always at school the next morning with a bright smile and learned quickly that the happy face makes everybody feel better. I was never physically abused, but I was abused on an emotional level. Nothing ever pleased my dad. So if I came home with a 95 on a test, I would be screamed at because I was being a failure. I was never praised for doing a good job because perfection was the only thing that was accepted. As a result, I did well in school and received many honor awards. I remember awards day at school looking into the stands for my dad that always promised to be there and never was. Something important always came up. Every year, every school event, every church event, my feelings of rejection were fed by him. I grew up in a small country church that was very legalistic. The pastor would say at least once a week that when you became a Christian, you were to go and sin no more. Christians were perfect people, and if you were not living a perfect life, then you were not saved. A miserable life, trying to be perfect at home, being perfectly at church, and being miserable all the time. As a result, I developed low self-esteem and a fear of failure. I really hated myself. In a sermon here at Celebration one week, Robert Russell, the pastor, stated how we see our earthly father is often how we see God. And it was true. I felt like God was disappointed in me, and I was constantly looking at me and my failures. In 2003, my life spun out of control. As a result of an unexpected death of the man I loved, my world crashed. He had promised he would never leave me. I remember standing in a parking lot with a friend one night, just sobbing, and she looked at me and said, "Honey, he didn't leave you for the blonde down the street. He died." Really, I quit eating, I quit sleeping, and I was an emotional mess. I would lay on the floor in my closet all night in a ball. I had nightmares that woke me screaming at the top of my lungs. When Don died, I only missed one day of work. Remember, I am the queen of the happy face. On the inside, I was dying, and on the outside, everybody remarked about how good I was doing. After several weeks of thinking I was going crazy, I finally got out the phone book and I called a therapist. Maybe not such a great idea to use the yellow pages and call the first person in the book, but that's what I did. He was a very nice man, and I went to him for about 18 months. He was struggling with a lot of things. I would go in, he would tell me all his problems for about an hour, and then I would pay him and leave. I knew he was not helping me, but I hated to leave him with nobody to talk to. Once he even sent me to a medium to discuss my problems. Oh, I know that was a bad idea, but guess what? I went anyway. And I remember her asking me if I was suicidal and telling her no, but a nice terminal illness would be good. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. I started attending Celebration in the fall of 2004. This was a new experience for me. I loved the weekend services, and the best part was I didn't know anybody here. So it was easy to keep on the happy face because I really didn't have to pretend much for people I knew. Shortly after coming here, I called my dad one morning. I needed help with a household project, and he had promised to help me. I had taken the day off from work and was expecting him. When he did not show up in a reasonable time frame, I followed up. He was in Memphis, Tennessee. Something important had come up. I remember just being devastated. I guess in my mind, I felt like I should have been important. I cried all day and the next day. That evening, a person called and invited me to dinner. There was no way I was going. I like isolation when I'm feeling down. I heard a voice tell me to say I was going to the night of worship at church. I told that to my friend, and snap, I was out of dinner. Now, I had another problem. I had just lied, and lying about going to church was probably not a good thing. So I showered, changed, and off to the night of worship I went. When the service came to an end, I went forward for prayer, and I laid my whole story on an elder. He immediately referred me to this program. I was not certain that I belonged to Celebrate Freedom, or Recovery as it was called at the time. I didn't have substance abuse issues. My first night here was a little overwhelming. I remember the testimony and going into small groups. I soon discovered that I had issues of codependency, rejection, abandonment, and a fear of failure. We basically all have the same issues, but how we deal with them is what makes us unique. The rejection and abandonment issues were most likely deep-rooted in the source of my problem. My codependency and perfectionism traits were my ways of coping and seeking acceptance. I worked these issues for quite some time. I learned that God loves me and accepts me for just the way I am. When I fail, His grace covers me. Just as He forgives, He expects that of me, and I have forgiven. I try to be a good daughter to my dad. I would like to say that he's changed over the years, but he's not. I have no control over his actions, but I can control my reactions, and through prayer many times, I try to exercise the same grace to him that God has bestowed on me. I've learned that having healthy boundaries are essential to good relationships. If you allow people to take advantage of you, you're the only one who's suffering. They will suck the life right out of you if you allow them. At times now, I still feel like I'm being mean, but I do have to protect myself and my emotions. I eventually led a group of teenagers here at Celebrating Freedom. One night, about 2.5 years ago, I got a text message from one of the girls. She was the young lady who never shared, and I had a feeling she was only here because she had to. As she began to text me the source of her problems that night, and as the messages began to fly on my phone, I sat in the middle of my floor and I cried. When it was over, I sent her a text message and asked, "So, what are you feeling?" And her reply back was, "I don't know." I then texted her 30 emails straight with emotions. She texted me back and said, "How do you know all of this?" Well, that was easy. she had just texted my story. She had been adopted through a series of bad situations and was struggling with so many issues. Later in the week, I met her to talk. As we walked out of her house, her adopted mother looked at me and said, "I hope you can help because she is not handling this the way she's supposed to." And I remember sitting at home thinking, apparently there's a book for adoptees on how we're supposed to handle things, and everybody's read it but us. I was a little annoyed, to be honest, and my exact thoughts to self were, none of this was her fault. She was the victim. Wait a minute. That finally hit me. If she was the victim, then I'm also the victim. None of the rejection and abandonment issues bestowed on me was anything that I caused, but it was the result of sin of others that had flowed down to me. Sadly enough, I had spent my life blaming myself for things that were never my fault. I developed a new sense of joy. On February 13th, 2012, I had a routine hysterectomy. I went into surgery with little thoughts or concerns other than being stuck, unable to drive. Cancer honestly never entered my mind. I felt the best I had in my whole life. I remember waking up in the recovery room, and the first thing I asked the nurse was if they had done my surgery laparoscopically. And when she said no, I looked at her and said, "Well, rats, that's going to be 2 weeks that I can't drive." Seriously, that was the only thing that ever entered my mind. Later that night, my doctor came in to check on me and explained everything that had happened in surgery. I was a little taken aback. I'd had complications. The procedure had taken much longer than anticipated, and I'd started to hemorrhage. During the surgery, they nicked my bladder and had to call a urologist for additional procedures. Overall, I still felt pretty good. The doctor gave me a hug and said, "We sent everything to the Mayo Clinic. We'll hope to get your results back before you're discharged." Okay, at this point, probably I should have picked up on something. But I figured they always did a biopsy, and, well, Mayo Clinic, I don't know. Did they always send stuff to Mayo Clinic? Really never entered my mind to be concerned. I was discharged, went home, life was good. About 10 days later, I went back to the doctor for my first post-op visit. He examined me, changed my dressing, and told me how well I was doing. I was putting on my sweater to leave when he said, "We need to discuss your biopsy." "Okay," I said. And then he spoke the words that would change my life forever. It all came back malignant. The uterus, both ovaries, both fallopian tubes, several masses. I was stunned. I remember saying, "But you got it all." And he looked at me and I said, "I hope, but I worry about the peripheral since I had no idea what I was dealing with." Then he said, "There's more. It's not a carcinogen, it's leiomyosarcoma, high grade." I was like, "Oh, well, what does that mean?" And that's when he said, "I'm sorry, there's no cure for leiomyosarcoma. You're dying." I was totally stunned. He told me he had ordered a full-body PET scan for Monday morning to see if and where the cancer had spread. He hugged me and told me he would pray for me every day. I checked out and walked to the car where a friend waited to drive me home. I remember her chatting and really just wanting her to hush. She took me home. I thanked her in the driveway. I did not ask her to come in. I did not want to chat with her. I had pretty much had all I could take. I went inside and called Barry and Linda Smith and relayed my visit to Linda. She promised me they would come over the next evening. When they came over, we talked, prayed, and Barry anointed me. We discussed healing that night and about God's ability to heal. I told them, let's be honest, God won't heal me. Why would he pick me? I wouldn't even pick me. I'm not a nice person. Linda patted my leg and said, it's not a choice. Jesus took away the cancer on the cross. It is yours to claim. It's for everybody. 2 nights later, I was struggling to hold it together, and I was pretty sure cancer was not going to kill me. A mental breakdown was. At 10:30 on Friday night, I called my best friend. When she answered the phone, my words were, the test came back as cancer, I'm dying. Okay, I probably should have handled that a little bit differently, but sometimes it's now or never. The next day, she called me to check on me and asked if I would like to go to church with her the next morning. I told her yes, and she said she would call back and discuss the arrangements. As I hung up, I wondered why I'd said yes. My friend lives nowhere near me. It was pretty inconvenient for her to come and get me, and if I wanted to go to church, my better options would have been my friend Becca or my friend Sandy. both of which live very close to me and attend my church. The next morning, Jan came and picked me up, and I found myself in a very quiet Methodist church and feeling very out of place. I remember thinking, God, why do you have me here? About that time, they asked us to stand and sing hymn number 262. As they opened the hymnal, the song was, Heal me, hands of Jesus. I shall read to you the first line. I will not sing it. Heal me, hands of Jesus, and search out all my pain. Restore my hope, remove my fear, and bring me peace again. I sat there quietly as the song was sung. After a short while, the preacher stood and began the morning prayer. He paused for a moment and said, I'm going to do something out of character. He went on to say he had not slept much the night before, and he felt like God had been speaking to him and telling him to say something. And he believed that God was telling him that he was going to use the Lenten season to supernaturally heal somebody so that he would be glorified. I remember looking around the room thinking, well, this pastor's not talking to me. I'm the visitor. I'll be honest, I really don't remember anything else of the message until the very end when we stood to sing the closing song, number 262, Heal Me, Hands of Jesus. We walked out, got in the car, and my friend asked if I enjoyed the service. I mumbled, yeah, but do you always sing that song twice? She slammed the car into park and looked at me. In the 20-some years I've been coming to this church, we've never sung that song, and we've never sung any song twice. The next morning, I drove myself to the hospital, quietly had my test, and drove home. On Wednesday, the doctor called with the results. 4 spots had showed up on the test. 3 tested positive for malignancy. 1 was not. He referred me to an oncologist right away. Friday, I saw an oncologist and left with more anxiety than I'd ever had in my life. I went home, and my prayer was simply, God, just send me somebody to talk to. The next morning at 8 o'clock, my doorbell rang, and it was one of my coworkers in her pajamas. I remember my first thought being, God, couldn't you find anybody else? But she was great, and I told her everything. She grabbed my computer and began to search for specialists. We found one in Pennsylvania and called. They answered the phone and scheduled an appointment with me on Friday of the following week. A few days later, a friend and I made the 8-hour trip to Philadelphia. I met with a specialist for 2 hours. At the end of the appointment, he looked at me and gave me 4 options. Number 1, I could die gracefully. Number 2, I could take chemo, which would extend my life to the time of the chemo, about 6 months. Number 3, I could have the test repeated in 60 days and see the rate the cancer was growing and choose between options 1 or 2. Or number 4, I could try to get into a clinical study. His words were, in order to live, you need a miracle. I'm here to tell you, you can search the world over and you will not find a person who works miracles. I picked up my purse, looked him in the eye, and said, I think I'll take option number 5. And he looked at me strangely and said, there is no option number 5. And that's when I proceeded to tell him I didn't need to look the world over. I knew a miracle worker. His name was Jesus, and he lived inside me. I walked out, and I cried for the first 5 hours on the way home. Finally, my friend looked at me and said, if this is the route you choose to take, you're going to need some backup. And I said, well, I don't know how to do that. She looked at me, handed me my phone, and told me to Facebook it. I made a couple calls to a couple people I felt deserved to hear this in person, and a couple hours later I posted, I'm really not sure how to say this other than I've been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. I've been given 0 chance of survival without a miracle. Please pray for me. Okay, again, maybe I need to work on my delivery, but within minutes the troops had been rallied and the prayers were being delivered en masse. The following Friday, the church had a prayer service, and I attended and went forward for prayer. When Robert Russell prayed over me, he prayed against any demonic spirit, any curse that had ever been prayed over me, and any spirit of death that had ever been placed upon me. I remember thinking that was sort of an odd prayer. When the service was over, the children's pastor approached me. According to her, the gossip was flying, and the kids were beginning to hear things, and she felt like I needed to talk to them. I teach Sunday school here on Sunday morning, for those of you that don't know that. So we decided the next weekend I would speak to them. The next morning, as I was drying my hair, I suddenly remembered the conversation I'd had with that medium. I raced to the car and started driving to Kingsport. I called Linda Smith and asked if I could come right over. I'm not sure what I'd have done if she'd have said no, since I was pulling in their driveway when she answered. I relayed my story, and they prayed specifically against the statement that I had made to the median and against the spirit of Satan that I had invited into my body. I encourage you to examine your lives and see if you've allowed Satan a foothold in any areas of your life and pray against those. I also talked with the Smiths at great length about my fear of allowing the children to pray for me and me dying. My greatest concern was what it would do to their faith. Barry told me I need to let God take care of that. He gave me a book to read and sent me home. A week later, I walked into this room and I talked to the kids at the Saturday night service. Before they were dismissed to the classes, I walked up, I took the microphone, then I leaned over to my friend Becca and said, now would be a great time to pray for me because I have no clue what I'm going to say. How do you explain to a 6-year-old something that you really don't understand yourself? I picked up the microphone, I laid it down, I walked a little closer, and then I said, the doctors have told me I'm very sick. I have something called cancer. Don't worry, you can't catch it. You can still shake my hand, give me a hug, high-five me, and you won't get it. But you need to know it's very serious. And well, the doctor told me without a miracle I'll die very soon. I told the doctors I know a miracle worker, and his name is Jesus, and he lives inside me. So if you think of me and want to pray for me, that'd be great. Several years ago, before I was discussing prayer with a friend, and he said he always felt like that instead of asking the elders to pray, that you should ask the children because they have more faith. In the book I referred to earlier, it states that at some point in life, we start living out of our imaginative right brains and start living out of our logical left brains. We stop living by faith and start living by logic. If you think about it, that's why we're told to come as little children. God doesn't ask us to logically think about healing, but to rely on Him in faith. The children were then explained what it means to lay hands on a person, and about 40 kids and teachers laid hands on me and prayed. When it was over and they were dismissed to their classes, my friend Becca looked at me and said, call your doctor now. I want those tests repeated tonight. After those prayers from those kids, it would be impossible for cancer to live in your body. I went home and cried myself to sleep again. The next morning, I repeated my story. We have a little boy by the name of Elijah who's autistic, and he doesn't say much. He doesn't like to be touched, and he certainly doesn't want you to touch him. As the kids began to pray for me, I felt somebody take my hands. He touched my hands, he touched my arm, he touched my hair, and as I began to cry, he wiped my eyes. When the service was over, I huddled in the floor and cried. At the 11 o'clock service, I repeated my story again. As the children gathered to pray, a teacher in the room said she saw him. He got down, he crawled, he scooted, he edged his way through a lot of kids until he was in front of me. And then as the kids began to pray for me, he reached out and touched my abdomen in exactly the spot where the cancer had been diagnosed. No, I didn't tell them where the cancer was. A couple days later, I found myself in a Bible study on the subject of prayer. The leader addressed why God does not always answer our prayers. Sometimes God says no because He has a better plan for us. But the main reason is we pray that God will answer our prayers, but then we really doubt that He will. We have to pray with faith that they'll be answered. So that night, as I went to bed, I thanked God for healing me for cancer. I thanked Him about 100 times in that first 24 hours, and truthfully, I didn't believe it a single time. The next day, I prayed it about 90 times, and I may have believed it twice. With each day, it got a little bit easier. We're told in Matthew 17:20, if you have faith as little as a mustard seed, you can move mountains, that nothing is impossible. My necklace has, in this little thing, a mustard seed, and it's just a reminder of how tiny our faith has to be for God to move. Yes, I believe God can move mountains, and yes, I believed God was bigger than cancer. I had no doubt that He could heal somebody else, but I did doubt that He could heal me. Remember, I have a pretty low opinion of myself. I understand grace, and I can apply it to sin, but to physical healing. Remember the story of the paralyzed man that Jesus healed. He said, take heart, son, your sins are forgiven. He was accused of blaspheming, and Jesus asked, which is greater to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? The grace of God also covers healing. The next day, I went in and I had a repeat PET scan. The nurse called about a week later with the results. The remaining 4 spots of cancer in my body had all regressed, about 50%. As of yesterday, I'm cancer-free. So, yeah. So that is my story of how big my God is. My challenge to you today is to answer the question of how big your God is. Thank you for letting me share.